Everyone is in their places with bright shining faces, which is kind of unusual. And it's a little bit early, but with all members here and all our witnesses online, and there's really no reason why we can't get started. So, with that, I will gavel the meeting to order. So the meeting is now formally before us, and we have with us uh, Jober Abma, a founder of HackerOne, and Deborah Chang, also from HackerOne, and in his individual, Steve Waterhouse. So I'm sure you've been briefed by the committee as to the process. So it's 10 minutes for the initial presentation, and then we'll go to Mr. Waterhouse for his 10-minute presentation, and then thereafter questions from members. Our second hour, colleagues, has collapsed, and so I intend to run over our time, assuming we do have some availability for our guests. So with that, I will turn it over to HackerOne and either Mr. Abma or Ms. Chang.
Hi, it's Debbie Chang. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you fine.
All right. Members of the House Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security, thank you for inviting us to speak today. I look forward to providing you with our perspective on cybersecurity and bug bounty programs. I am Vice President of Business Development and Policy of San Francisco-based HackerOne, the world's leading provider of hacker-powered security. I'm here with Yobert Abba, the founder of HackerOne. He founded the company when he was 23 years old and has been hacking since he was 13. HackerOne operates bug bounty programs that connect companies and governments with the best white hat hackers in the world to find and fix vulnerabilities before malicious actors exploit them. As of January 2019, over 300,000 white hat hackers have registered with HackerOne to defend customers, among them the United States Department of Defense, removing over 80,000 vulnerabilities and preventing an untold number of breaches in the process. Today's cybersecurity practices are severely outdated in contrast to the cyber threats that society faces. When exploited for criminal purposes, even just one single and relatively unremarkable security vulnerability can create havoc, as the Equifax data breach grossly reminded us of in 2017. In 2018, many other breaches have made the press, including the WannaCry ransom attack. For financial institutions, fraud incidents, both online and offline, have increased by more than 130% in 2018, resulting in significant monetary and reputational losses. In the UK, the number of cyber attacks against UK financial services companies reported to the UK's Financial Conduct Authority has risen by more than 80% in the last year. It is an unfortunate fact that in the digital realm, society is currently failing to provide its citizens with what societies were established for, safety and security. I would like to talk now about hacker-powered security, a scalable model that can be used to prevent cyber attacks in society as a whole, especially the financial industry and national security. Whatever protections and defenses we build into our digital assets, and we should build a lot of them, there's one practice that covers every possible cause of cyber breach. There's an immune system that will approach the digital assets from the same direction as adversaries and criminals do, from the outside. There's a mechanism that at scale has the opportunity to ultimately detect every hole, every weakness, and every security vulnerability in a system or product built by humans. This practice is often called hacker-powered security. Hacker-powered security covers any cybersecurity enhancing services and automations that are partially or wholly produced by independently operating security experts outside the company or organization in question. It is a model that invites external and independent security researchers and ethical hackers to hunt for vulnerabilities in computerized systems. These are individual experts who have signed up to help corporations and organizations to detect and fix their security weaknesses. The most fundamental function of hacker-powered security is a vulnerability disclosure program, also called responsible disclosure or coordinated vulnerability disclosure. A vulnerability disclosure program is essentially a neighborhood watch for software. The motto is, if you see something, say something. Concretely, if and when an ethical hacker finds a security vulnerability in a company or government organization's website or mobile app or other computer system, this person will be invited to disclose the vulnerability found to the system's owner. Most human beings are ready to help their neighbor, so the impetus for vulnerability disclosure is enormous. Issues of legality and trust, however, make vulnerability disclosure more complicated than a regular neighborhood watch. To solve this issue, leading companies have created their own policy frameworks for the disclosure of vulnerabilities to them, and others turn to companies such as HackerOne to organize and coordinate such programs. When an entity decides to offer financial rewards to finders of vulnerabilities, the vulnerability disclosure program is called a bug bounty program. Bug bounty programs have existed since at least 1983. The practice was perfected by Google, Facebook, and Microsoft over the past half dozen years. Hacker-powered security programs have demonstrated their effectiveness compared to other methods of vulnerability detection. Hiring full-time employees or external service or product vendors to test for vulnerabilities is more expensive. No other method for validating software or manufactured products that are in use by consumers has been shown to produce similar results at such a favorable economic unit price. Hacker-powered security is a model that scales. Today, there are over 300,000 registered ethical hackers on our platform alone, and over the coming years, we hope this number grows to over 1 million. The army of hackers will be able to take on the work of the entire digital realm of our society. Thanks to the diversity and scale of the hacker community, hacker-powered security finds vulnerabilities that automated scanners or permanent penetration testing teams do not find. Existing models are good at finding predictable security vulnerabilities, but even more important is to find the unpredictable ones, the unknown unknowns. Given a large enough hacker community and enough time, such vulnerabilities will be identified. Entities that operate such vulnerability disclosure and bug bounty programs include Adobe, AT&T, US Department of Defense, Dropbox, Facebook, General Motors, Google, Microsoft, Nintendo, Starbucks, Shopify, Twitter, and United Airlines. Specifically in the financial industry, American Express, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, ING, and TD Ameritrade have public VDPs. The US Department of Defense and HackerOne pioneered the first federal government bug bounty program. Since the program's inception, more than 5,000 security vulnerabilities have been safely resolved in DoD critical assets with hacker-powered security. While the majority of the vulnerabilities reported through the DoD were without financial compensation, hackers have been awarded hundreds of thousands of dollars in bug bounty payments by the DoD. A question I get a lot is, who are these hackers? Security experts may be described using a variety of titles, including ethical hacker, white hat, security researcher, bug hunter, and finder. One title is conspicuously absent: criminal. Hackers are not criminals. Specifically, bug bounty programs offer no benefit to someone with criminal intent. On the contrary, HackerOne will record data about every hacker on the platform and only reward actions that follow the rules. For these reasons, criminals go elsewhere. Hackers are driven by a variety of motivations, many of which are altruistic. The security advocacy organization I Am the Cavalry summarizes these motivations as protect, make the world a safer place; puzzle, tinker out of curiosity; prestige, seek pride and notability, profit to earn money, and protest or patriotism, ideological and principled. A 2016 study by the U.S. National Telecommunications and Information Administration within the Department of Commerce found that only 15% of security researchers expect financial compensation in response to vulnerability disclosure. Hacker-powered security does not only improve security, the model democratizes opportunity and offers meaningful work to anyone with the inclination and drive to be a useful ethical hacker. Many hackers are young adults. They can do their work from anywhere. The money hackers make is used to support families, pay for education, and catapult them into successful professional careers. Hacking brings meaning and mandate to enterprising people irrespective of their location. Hacking brings positive societal impact across the nation. In conclusion, we need hackers. Our goal must be an internet that enables privacy and protects consumers. This is not achievable without ethical hackers taking an active role in safeguarding our collective security. Hackers are truly the immune system of the internet. They are the positive power in society. We must enable them to encourage contributions. This requires a safe legal environment, encouraging all individuals to come forward with vulnerability information, no matter what the circumstance. To close,
okay. Finish your closing statement.
Okay, to close, I repeat the words of numerous experts that a ubiquitous see something, say something practice for vulnerabilities is a vital and critical step towards improving cybersecurity for consumers. The absence of a formal channel to receive vulnerability reports reduces a vendor security posture and introduces unnecessary risk. Corporations and the government should welcome input from external parties regarding potential security vulnerabilities. And the Canadian government should encourage, if not require, that behavior. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important issue.
Thank you very much. And with that, we'll turn to Mr. Waterhouse.
Thank you to the committee for the invitation to share insights on some of the problematics that are perceived by fellow citizens with their access and or security to their earnings, savings versus computer technologies. But first, a brief intro of where I come from. After serving with the Canadian Forces and D&D for 23 years, I was privileged to be among the first cyber soldiers in the country to manage network information systems from LAN size of about 250 users to MAN size of about 5,000 users, multi-sites at a base level. It's in its early stage of integration in order to provide the right information to the command structure, which was previously a paper-based process from normal day-to-day office tasks to academic activities like what I was doing at the CMR Saint Jean, and as well as in operations. More recently, my job is educating, training professionals and the public on how to apply the best practices of information technologies, and to as well as to explain in plain language, as we will do today, what is to happen in the cyberspace that affects everyone and everything on almost a daily basis with the news medias. I shall present these insights in the following way. La situation. Il est minuit et quart. Comme vous le savez, nous sommes au 21e siècle. Plus connectés.
It is midnight, as you know. We are in the 21st century and we're more connected than ever. Automation is more and more integrated in our lives. The economy of the country depends in a large part on the use of technology. Same thing for SMEs and big business. However, reality is catching up with us very quickly. I've given you a few examples to illustrate the fact that these problems are repeated over time, but they remain concerning in the present. This is the case for poor configuration by programmers, etc. Anyone who takes the time to learn about technologies can hack, commit breaches. We find on the internet information that helps people find a way to breach any or all vulnerabilities in a system, and in most cases, people are able to obtain information that will help them have monetary gains on the stock market. Over the last few years, especially in 2017, 2018, we saw the persistent virulence of ransomware, and not just individuals are targeted. Any organization can be the target of such attacks. The problem is that people are ill-informed and they're unable to detect the menace, the threat. It is more and more difficult to distinguish between false and true messages that appear in one's mailbox. Today, financial institutions ask and even demand that their clients carry out their transactions using a PC, a portable phone, or similar means. As in the workplace, there is an expectation that the citizen, customer, worker will be aware of how Windows 10 functions with the most recent Microsoft updates. This absence of knowledge or training or the basic tools are such that people carry out their financial transactions using public Wi-Fi connections that you find in hotels or restaurants, or they use their cell phone. There again, it's not safe, and cell phones are often hacked. This lag in the deployment of high-speed connectivity in the regions adds to the cynicism that people feel with regard to access to high speed. As an example, merchants and homeowners in Port-au-Prince will obtain optic fiber more quickly than a lot of people who live maybe 50 kilometers from Montreal.
Well, I say take the lead and lead by example. It was with much of enthusiasm that I heard the setup of the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity last October. This distinction of cyber as a separate component of cybersecurity needed to be on its own in order to underline its importance. Too often have I encountered in large enterprises as well as SMBs having the consideration of a computer security be under the responsibility of the first appointed volunteer in the room. A necessary evil to many, but by having the federal government proceeding that way, little reasons can be found by any enterprises to set aside matters of cybersecurity, hence put the matters front and center. The CCC's recent changes in resources devoted to cybersecurity was long overdue. Canada used to be the nation of telecommunications firsts. Now we are dragging behind the rest of the world, trying to keep up with technological wave of innovations. We had the best telecommunication equipment maker in the world. We used to have it, called Nortel. It was taken away from us. Canada was one of the first nation to be standing up as leaders in quantum security of computer networks. Most of its research was taken away from us recently. Strengthening the information systems of the government has been greatly improved to ensure the availability of information systems when anyone wants to consult his or her information at any given time. As you have come to know, the prime target in computer exploitation is going after the weakest link, and that is the human component still to this day. Particularly the average citizen at home or on the road, the emphasis is to have strong economy while using IT through information technology, through educating those who uses that technology, which makes pretty much everyone nowadays, and with a live approach, not just a computer-based training, in order to grasp immediate feedback and reassure the citizens or the user. Mr. and Mrs. Everyone are using incomplete software and hardware daily brought to this market without any guarantees that it will work or won't fail. I mean, with cars are sold here in the country, it comes with all sorts of seals of approval, and Transport Canada oversees its safety. You can buy a set of Christmas lights anywhere in the country where they're sold. It comes with a seal of approval from the CSA. That Industry Canada oversees its application and safety. But who does the same to control and validate computer code or hardware? These devices on which we depend each day, known to be named IoTs today, are roaming freely all around us without any form of safety certifications. An insulin pump, for example, although the importation and sale of such devices seems to be regulated by Health Canada, who oversees the code used by these devices and maintain people alive? Are they doing the right thing? Are pacemakers in the same situation? I believe they are. Who certifies the computer code for ATMs to ensure Canadian citizens have access to their money when needed? Or smart dolls, have we come to hear they're being sold here in North America, but have been declared illegal spying devices in Germany. Because of privacy issues with KID, who is supposed to protect our children's privacy here from these immoral devices, if not the Privacy Commissioner? Hardware and software code should be overseen by an independent government agency like CSA, as an example. Ideally, that could at least have, this agency could have a word to say about what's distributed for life-critical devices and impose stiff penalties for non-conforming products or simply ban them from the market. In that matter, we are now confronted with a new dynamic in today's economy, use of biometrics to do business. In July of last year, the Chinook shopping mall in Calgary was caught embedding facial recognition cameras in the interactive panels of the mall to document the clientele at that place, without any warning whatsoever to lead people to know they're being documented. Complaints were made to the Privacy Commission of Canada and Alberta. To this date, no reports from these investigations, started in August 2018, have been published. And just I came in just from the Promenade Gatineau, and I've documented that these panels over there at the Promenade Gatineau, not from the same company, do embed cameras on the panels without any warnings that people are documented at that place. We are now confronted with a similar situation at Place Laurier, where 4 stores are openly documenting facial recognition in the goal of documenting the client's feedbacks by their biometric characteristics. This kind of tracking is already happening with cell phones, of course, and fidelity card consumers use in stores. It will certainly be beneficial for everyone that the OPC grants authorization after a proper accreditation process to organizations and businesses in the use of biometric technology in order to minimize cost overruns of inquiries and at the same time reassure the public that the government has the citizens' back with privacy matter. Est-il trop tard? Je crois qu'il est encore temps de bien faire.
Is it too late? I think we still have time to do the right thing. As is the case with any tool, you have to read the manual before you use it. Have you ever read the Windows 10 or Windows 7 or Windows 8 or Windows XP manual? I don't believe so, because it's a document that is very voluminous and people are afraid of it. And this is where calling upon a third party is necessary. People who use machines still need other people to guide them. Your study will certainly help us improve what isn't working properly and also generated the needed momentum so that the various stakeholders continue to contribute to a better economy.
Thank you, Mr. Waterhouse, Ms. Chang, and Mr. Abma. Our first questioner is Ms. DeBruzen. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you. So there was a bit of a repeating theme that happened from last week, and I was really struck by the evidence that we heard last week. It was described that, you're looking at the financial institution, it's the armored vehicle, and it's delivering between 2 cardboard boxes, which is the humans at either end. And I believe the number we had was something like 60% of cybersecurity issues were human created as to the end users. So that's something that's really struck out. And you mentioned it. Are we reading the manuals? I don't think we are reading all the manuals, and I don't know if that's reasonable to expect that we would. But so the question is, you've mentioned government certification, for end users is one part, but another big piece is the education. And for HackerOne, I was looking at one of your newsletters, and you had something about phishing. It was a phishing quiz. It was really hard. So my question, I guess, is if you had, say, 3 things that you would suggest if we were trying to get out there as to how to properly educate people, because that seems to be one of our biggest issues. What would they be? And if I could start with you, Mr. Waterhouse.
Thank you, ma'am, for the question. Throughout the country, I've done some training, and I do a lot of conferences on cybersecurity. And as I teach professionally, I can tell you the utmost necessity is to have people stop in time and take the matter, read about whatever they're doing. We're laughing about the fact that we never read about any manuals. That's true, but they're superseded often with legal liabilities and obligations that discourages people, or in fact anyone, from reading beyond that point. So people will just figure it out. The graphical user interface have been so I say successful, that people just intuitively make out their way and using 5, maybe 10% of the full capacity of a software. So I saw that transition when secretaries moved from WordPerfect 5.2 to Microsoft Word, and they would just they had to go on courses because they were two separate kind of software, and they were master at WordPerfect, which nobody was afterwards in Word.
Read the manuals. So you're telling us to read
They
the
could
manuals.
not. They could not read the manual because it was so complicated. It was such a complete package. It would have been just a week-long course. And they went to those week-long course, but they were fractioned into 3 different level of difficulties: beginner, advanced, and then expert level. So these were secretaries that were at the expert level at one software. Now the new one comes around, they're at the beginner level. So that draws down the efficiency of the workforce and slows down the effectiveness of the economy, I say. And for that reason, same thing with let's say Windows version 15 is around the corner for next year. How much people will be able to know how it works? And then the adoption curve has been very, very steep.
I'm going to go to HackerOne quickly because the phishing quiz there was a Google something quiz, but it was hard. So do you have any idea, like simple things people are trying to figure out how they don't want to be a cardboard box?
Thanks for the question, ma'am. I would like to point out that I think in the recent years, the behavior of consumers have changed radically. Up until 5 years ago, our data used to be at like large organizations, and they would have like large teams who would help us consumers protect against data breaches and protect our privacy. And I think consumer behavior has changed in where we actually become responsible for our own privacy. And like Mr. Waterhouse pointed out, we do not take responsibility to the point where it is necessary today to actually do that. What I would like to add is that I don't believe that it is up to the consumer to guarantee their own privacy. I actually believe that the organizations should help consumers and organizations to protect consumers and their users for these data breaches. And so, but with that, like I said earlier, them being responsible themselves, it is important that we do quizzes like the phishing test that you were referring to make people aware of some of the risks that happen when they store their data either in a certain system or with a certain organization. But that is both a problem that we need to address from the consumer side as well as from the organizations that have a copy of that data.
All right. No, thank you. Actually, if I can stay with your group, because one of the things you talked about was the importance of being able to report vulnerabilities, so that if a hacker finds a vulnerability, to be able to report it. And you mentioned that there was an issue of legality with that. What is a legal challenge that they will be charged criminally? Like what would we need as the legal protection for the hackers doing good?
That's a great question. In the U.S., there is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which was passed in the 1980s, that says something to the effect of you can't hack and enter in an unauthorized manner to a company's digital asset. But that was obviously back in the 1980s, and it has not been updated since. I believe Canada has a version of that law as well. So what we would encourage the Canada to do is to pass a law to encourage all organizations with a digital asset to adopt some form of policy to invite the public, and you don't even need to call them hackers, but invite the public to report any bugs and vulnerabilities that they happen to find. And so that is just inviting them in, saying what's in scope and what is permitted and what isn't, as well as what you might specifically be looking for. And then importantly, offering a communication channel within the organization, and then setting up a process in which to receive that information, as well as the resources to fix it. And so that's what we would generally encourage the governments to do, is to pass a law to encourage that type of behavior.
I have 20 seconds, so just if I could, the other question is, so you tell this one company, here's here's a bug. We found a deficiency or a vulnerability here. Then you might have a whole bunch of companies using the exact same type of software, whatever. They have the same vulnerability. What do we need to do to be able to share that vulnerability information across different businesses or organizations?
Very briefly, please.
There's a process called vulnerability coordination, where you would work together with the vendor themselves to coordinate that vulnerability, to disclose it to other organizations that are using the same vulnerability.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Brusen. Mr. Paulus, 7 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, everyone. My first question would be for Mr. Abma. Last September, Scott Jones, director of the Canadian Centre for Cyber Security, declared to the committee that he was convinced that there are in Canada sufficient guarantees to allow us to face the risks of espionage or piracy by China. And he said that we didn't necessarily have to follow the example of our Five Eyes allies. I would like to know what you could tell us about the strength, the vigor of our Canadian cyberspace.
Thank you for the question, sir. So today, there's yet to be a government that is immune to cybersecurity threats. The U.S. has some of the most developed cyber practices in the world, as has Canada, as Mr. Waterhouse also pointed out. It is also home to the companies with the most mature security practices in the world. Even so, hacks may still happen, and so we're up against a race. The internet is a very complex system with a lot of people contributing to it. Everything is tied together. Systems and networks change or contain hundreds of thousands of individual hardware and software components and thousands of lines of code. And every time code is updated, which may actually happen multiple times a day, new vulnerabilities may be introduced. There will always be unknown unknowns. And the only way to really know to uncover these unknown unknowns is to invite good hackers to test the system. And even with systems who have been proven to be very secure, that may changes that may happen overnight, either because of an internal change or an external change, vulnerabilities may arise.
Okay. Maintenant, j'aimerais savoir.
Now, I would like to know, on the American side, what's happening with your teams of hackers? Are they prepared to manage the 5G threats? Can they manage 5G today?
So good hackers come across new technology every day. They will have to familiarize themselves with new technology in order to be able to find security vulnerabilities in them, or in components that are built on top of technologies like 5G. With our diverse customer base, there are a lot of opportunities and incentives for the hacker community to dive into these new technologies. And as 5G becomes mainstream, we believe that there will be more people who are capable of auditing the security of such components. At this time, there are multiple customers of HackerOne that are launching a component on top of 5G, and they're exposing that technology to some of the hacker community, which we believe is the right way for us to uncover some of these security vulnerabilities that are currently unknown to us or the United States.
Vous avez établi des relations.
You've established relationships. You're working with your clients, the U.S. Department of State, the Pentagon. These are HackerOne clients, customers. How did you go about establishing a trust relationship with these people? And how might we be able to do this? Are there practices that Canada should adopt in this area?
All of the hackers who have participated in the DoD-related programs were hand-selected by the DoD and HackerOne because of our expertise and track record. We are complementary to our customers and government, or we're complementary to what our customers and government is already doing. We have a proven track record in hacker-powered security. And having coverage in both the government and the private sectors furthers or strengthens our mission, which is to empower the world to build a safer internet. We believe or to this date, over 5,000 vulnerabilities have been uncovered in the US DoD systems, of which the majority have actually been reported to the DoD without any incentives or monetary incentives. We believe that a vulnerability disclosure program or establishing a process to do so is our recommendation to every government on this planet in order to ensure that they can work with the hacker community according to the see something, say something principle.
OK, merci. Et juste pour rapidement l'intérêt du...
And quickly, I have a photo of your corporate brochure here. I'm saying this for the benefit of the committee, and there's a picture of hackers who are working for national defense. And these people are the best, even though they don't want to wear a uniform. A question for Mr. Waterhouse now. In the financial area, are we doing enough to protect citizens in their daily lives? I would say that financial institutions, well, their view is that they're doing enough, yes. From the point of view of the customer of a financial institution, the answer would be no, because often the customer will call upon the institution and will be asked to use the tools provided by the institution. But the person goes home with these tools, with an access to the system or an application, and really doesn't know how it works. So the risk falls upon the shoulders of the customer of the financial institution. And if he or she makes a mistake, it's his or her fault, and not that of the institution. And that's what's unfortunate, because I was explaining that you have to know how to use your systems. The next Android phone will be up to the task. People won't know how to use it any better than is the case today. So training is important, and it will target just one application. And as soon as the application changes, as soon as the look and feel changes, the person has to learn how to use this new tool. And this is what we've seen over the last 30 years on the market. As soon as the apparatus changes in its feel and touch, then the customer has to adapt. We have to be shown how to use the new apps, etc. So the best way to raise awareness is what? Well, I would say that financial institutions should invest more in training of customers, of their clients, in financial training sessions, not just with a little video that someone digs up on the internet. They need interactive information, because that would allow them to really determine if the customer has understood the message. If you're training someone with a time lag, people can pause and repeat the lesson. It's wonderful. People can key in, they can press pause and go to another room, and you're never sure if the person has really heard the whole message. Thank you very much, Mr. Paulus. 7 minutes for Mr. Dubé now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
For one, since the example I'm going to use is what's going on in the U.S. currently. So you have something called, the NSA does what they call vulnerabilities equities process, so VEP essentially. I was actually asked about this by a journalist probably about a year ago, because our sort of not quite equivalent, it's not always exactly analogous, but body here, CSC, doesn't have the same kind of transparent process. I'm just wondering if you could talk about whether that process has been, in your mind, given the work that you do, successful at all in having more transparency when the agencies themselves are discovering vulnerabilities in software that they could potentially use to glean all kinds of information on people, obviously.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. Thank you for the question, sir. The U.S. Government has spent a lot of money and time to securing their own systems. I think that data shows that after they've established a transparent process to work with the hacker community, over 5,000 security vulnerabilities have been identified, for which more than or hundreds of thousands of dollars have been awarded as an additional incentive for those hackers to look into those systems. The number of vulnerabilities that have been discovered by the hacker community are vastly is a much higher volume compared to some of the vulnerabilities that have been identified by the US government themselves. And the fact that there are so many of them shows that working with the hacker community is the right thing to do in order to uncover more security vulnerabilities.
So that's an interesting point because it leads me to another question that I had, which is to say, do you think there should be, so let me back up for a minute. If law enforcement wants to, say, unlock an iPhone to obtain information that's on it, there's obviously a process in place with obtaining a warrant. It might vary, obviously, in both our countries, but I think the spirit of it is similar enough that we can discuss it. Because my question then becomes, if a hacker wants to do, let's just say, good, white hat, might look to the government thinking that they're doing the right thing by providing that information, but it doesn't necessarily then go back to the company, and people remain vulnerable because that agency might have an interest in keeping that vulnerability. So do you think there should be some kind of law or regulation in place that creates the same kind of checks and balances that, say, the police obtaining a warrant to unlock a phone should apply to national security agencies, to say, if you want to use a vulnerability, then you have to go through the same hoops that are required for law enforcement to protect people's privacy?
Thank you for that question. It is an ethical dilemma that I think is a very important one to cover. The problem that we've seen so far is by governments buying zero-day vulnerabilities, so vulnerabilities that are not known to the vendor who is there to patch them, are currently being used in warfare in order to extract information or like intelligence that was currently unknown to them. But by not disclosing that to the vendor, you're also putting your consumers or your citizens at risk by not disclosing that. We believe that zero-day vulnerabilities should be reported to the vendor no matter what. But we're addressing that from a separate or a different side. We're addressing that by leveraging the hacker community to find the same vulnerabilities that either the government or criminals have found, which will then be disclosed to the vendor directly. And that is our way to make sure that those vulnerabilities are becoming known to the vendor. With that, it would be amazing, in my opinion, if the government would also have a law like that, because I don't believe that it is worth the risk for your own citizens. But I think that is we're far away from that today.
I appreciate that response. The last question I had too, et je la poserai à vous, Mr. Waterhouse, également, is just the question of...
And it's for you, Mr. Waterhouse.
That some of these vulnerabilities get reported on. And one example that jumped to mind, and I don't recall if I saw this in the coverage or if someone just told this to me anecdotally, so it could be wrong, but when the most recently last week with the vulnerability in FaceTime on iPhones and iPads was found, the individual who was essentially not intending to find that, who found it, was then asked by Apple to sort of go through their process almost as if they themselves were going for the bug bounty without being a hacker. And so I'm just wondering, when some of these vulnerabilities get found by accident, reported in the media, what impact that has on how things play out, both for the vulnerability itself, but also for trying to fix it and afterwards. Puis, Mr. Waterhouse, si vous voulez commenter là-dessus également ensuite.
Mr. Waterhouse, if you would like to contribute something?
Is so much incomplete. We have billions of line of codes right now in any kind of application, especially as operating systems, that it's almost virtually impossible to, because of the competition also is very strong on the market, they just push out the software incomplete as it is, and they just say, we'll fix it as we go. This is one of the reasons why we're getting these kind of findings once in a while. So by an engineering analysis, people back at the company would say, well, nobody will think about doing that. But guess what? In the real world, we have people that are just doing whatever they seem interesting to find out. And yes, by accident, they find these vulnerabilities, we call them today. Should they be disclosed monetarily? Of course. I mean, the youngster went on, and his parents went on to disclose it, and lawfully. They didn't want to exploit the situation. They just wanted to report it, and they got turned down even by the company. So certainly, I reach you on this. There should be a law that says to a company, and whenever someone gets to you, listen to him, or whatever party is bringing you the information, and act upon it promptly. If not, they should be fine.
I think I have about 30 seconds left if you guys wanted to jump in there.
I'd like to jump in. I think fundamental to this discussion is privacy. And when I read about that situation, privacy, in our opinion, is a fundamental right, and your data is a fundamental right. And so a company should be strongly encouraged to protect one's rights. And in that case, I think the mom contacted Apple, a couple times, and she was protecting her rights and her son's rights and her family's rights. And so to not have a VDP or a way to handle these issues is infringing on one's privacy rights.
Merci, Monsieur Dubé. Monsieur Picard, 7 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. HackerOne, when you submit your report on vulnerabilities to financial service providers, what kind of feedback do you get from your recommendation? Do they implement them right away, or do they evaluate the cost of implementation versus the cost of taking the risk not to?
Thank you for that question, sir. At the end of the day, a mature security organization is something where, or is an organization where every risk or every vulnerability that is being uncovered, regardless of its source, should be put through what the investment would be in order to protect the organization to the threat that was reported. We've seen many organizations, including financial organizations, who have put in different defenses based on the vulnerabilities that have been reported to them in order to eradicate entire vulnerability classes. There are, or to protect consumers against security threats like the two-factor authentication that is often used when you sign into a bank account. The security vulnerabilities that are most common are usually pretty straightforward in order to address by the company, but especially with the data that we have, we can help an organization to prioritize in-depth defenses in order to protect the organization better long-term.
A-t-on l'impression, Monsieur Wallace,
Mr. Waterhouse, the products that we use in financial services at present that are subject to some vulnerabilities, do we deem that these services are so weak that the vulnerabilities that are reported are virtually beginner level, insignificant, so to speak, or have we reached a stage where the software is so sophisticated that despite everything, there do remain a few vulnerabilities that request or demand a higher level of knowledge? Where are we at in the spectrum? Well, those are the two extremes of the spectrum. The largest Indian bank last week had a breach because there was a non-secure server without any passwords on board. So that was a mega bank. There was a system that was very vulnerable. So that was a basic beginner type error. If we look at our financial institutions here in this country, they work with the best equipment possible. They have the resources to equip themselves with this, and they'll have the best capabilities. But it nevertheless remains that these are commercial products available to any company in the world, and they're exposed subject to the same vulnerabilities. So you need a team to audit and counter-audit these systems in a continuum and not do like most SMEs do. They install a firewall and they say, we're fine and dandy and we can go to bed now. There is equipment that's vulnerable and there have to be constant audits and verifications.
as a financial service provider, I may choose to split my data as much as possible, like to complicate things if I want to put data together and create some intelligence out of that. Or if I go in the concept of open banking, I centralize everything on one server for performance and efficiency. What seems to be a good strategy? Because we have both strategies on the table to discuss these days. HackerOne.
Thank you for the question. One of the problems that we've seen especially with some of the more recent data breaches is that centralization of data is becoming a problem. It makes it easier for the organization to protect themselves against certain risks because it is only one component that they have to defend against. The problem is that when things do go wrong, either it is a misconfiguration on the organization side, like that happened in India, or negligence or a vulnerability in a third-party software, the consequences are usually too big to oversee. Decentralization, on the other hand, is much harder to maintain. There's a lot more moving components, but from a data privacy perspective, it does look like the right way to go, or the right strategy to take. When you're talking about some of the insights that can be gained when it is a central system, the same thing can be achieved with multiple systems, with decentralized systems. But instead of using the data themselves, extrapolate the data or the insights away from that data and only use that to either give recommendations or do the data analysis that is required to do. With that, a lot of organizations are moving to the cloud, which is essentially the same problem that large organizations face by centralizing a lot of that data. So we are seeing an uptick in the number of breaches that happen because people are unaware of some of the consequences that it has by putting data into a system that they don't fully understand, which also goes back to Mr. Waterhouse's point that consumers don't read the manuals, but sometimes organizations also don't understand the threat that they're putting themselves up against by moving into new territory.
I just have 1 minute left, Mr. Waterhouse. On a des logiciels qui sont
We have software that is weak, very vulnerable, and we're starting to consider the use of artificial intelligence to help people control what we can't really understand. Are we going into this blind because artificial intelligence is programmed by humans? Mr. Picard, same thing for today's software. Programmers put forward incomplete exploitation systems. They use software to do data processing, and the software is incomplete. So will artificial intelligence do a better job? Well, we want to be on the avant-garde of security protection, but I don't think that artificial intelligence will be completely impermeable. Same question for HackerOne?
HackerOne, final word on that?
Artificial intelligence is, in my opinion, a very important technology that we should leverage as much as possible. At the end of the day, we believe that where people work, people will make mistakes. And so artificial intelligence is not going to help us to protect against these threats. When artificial intelligence can be used in order to come up with defenses in order to protect us better, we believe that that is the right thing to do, but it is not a permanent fix or permanent solution in order to protect oneself against security threats.
Thank you, Mr. Picard. Mr. Motz, 5 minutes. Oh, hang on. We've got confusion here. Mr. Palus.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listen, Mr. Chairman, I would like to take a bit of time here. I thank our witnesses for their participation, but there's a situation at the Immigration Committee right now. A colleague has just tabled a motion there.
At the end of the meeting, just like that?
Je vais faire rapidement, Monsieur le Président.
I'll cover the matter quickly, Mr. Chairman.
Je vais lire rapidement ma motion, puis le comité pourra en...
I'll read it quickly, and the committee will be able to decide.
The end of the meeting, but if you insist on going forward, I have to take it out of your time, which is really regrettable because I love Mr. Motz's questions. Okay,
Je vais continuer, Monsieur le Président.
Forgive me, but I'll continue. So the motion from my colleagues that in accordance with the 1.8.1a and b of the standing orders, the committee sit with the Citizenship Committee and the Immigration Committee to determine if there were deficiencies in the safety clearances for Canadians where gaps might exist in the process, both at official points of entry and between points of entry, to identify the causes and impacts of these gaps and propose potential solutions that departmental officials and ministers from both immigration, refugees, and citizenship and public safety and emergency preparedness be present for at least one meeting, that officials and elected representatives from the United States, Federal Congress, and Senate be invited to attend, that these meetings be held before Friday, March 1st, that the committee report its findings to the House, and that pursuant to Standing Order 109, the government table a comprehensive response thereto.
And has proper notice. It's properly before the committee. I would have preferred another time, but that it is what it is, and I'm assuming somebody wants to speak to it. Ms. Damoff.
Thank you.
Again, I apologize to witnesses, but this is the
Thank
way
you,
things
Chair,
work.
and I too apologize to the witnesses taking up your time. I'm disappointed, but I guess I shouldn't be surprised by this motion. It's typical of what the Harper Scheer conservative style of politics has become, and they want Canadians to be afraid, and once again are choosing to scapegoat newcomers.
Monsieur le Président,
Yes.
je crois
Mr.
que j'ai tout simplement.
Mr. Chairman, I just tabled a motion in accordance with the standing orders that apply to the House, and my colleague is playing politics right now.
We could minimize the partisanship on a partisan motion. The chair would be much happier. So, Ms. Damoff, if you could speak to the motion, please.
The fact is, Chair, that Canadians can and should feel safe and secure knowing we have a secure border and a strong screening system. Their safety has not and will never be compromised, and so we will not be supporting this motion.
Further debate? Seeing none. Those in favor of the motion? Those opposed? Motion defeated. Okay, we're back on. Mr. Motz, you have 2 minutes left.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is to Hacker One. You've basically dominated the American ethical hacker business. Do you have suggestions for best practices here in this country, and how we might be able to establish that sort of reputation with the private side of ethical hacking here?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Mutz. We believe that hacker-powered security is the key to empower the world to build a safer internet. Leveraging the hacker community is one of the components to a mature security organization. HackerOne leverages data to help organizations in order for them to build a mature security organization and help them prioritize what to work on. So we encourage everybody to establish at least a vulnerability disclosure policy in order to work with the hacker community to uncover the unknown unknowns, being the security vulnerabilities in their system.
Thank you for that. In my limited time, I want to ask Mr. Waterhouse, so the electromagnetic pulse attack in Canada and its impact on the financial institutions, can you talk about that for us and explain the vulnerabilities we have there?
Certainly, Mr. Mons, it's a known fact that throughout the world we have nation states that are actively developing such a weapon. And an EMP, electromagnetic pulse weapon, will be one that will be completely frying any electronic components, if not to say the electrical grid. So we will come back to, let's say, 100 years ago, how to live in our society. We had a few examples in the past. We had the Carrington event that happened in the 1800s. We had Hydro-Quebec that was submitted to a natural EMP from the sun in 1989. That rendered for 8 hours the provincial power grid offline. And we see ongoing development, especially like in the United States. They're forthcoming in saying that they want to have these kind of weapons because they're not conventional kinetic weapon that can kill people. They will just neutralize the electrical environment. So that's even if there's no electricity even around, well, people will go crazy. As I was witness to some of that feud in 1998 with the ice storm, where for 22 such days nobody had access to power, then nobody had access to their money, and so on. So it is a direct threat to our way of life that few organizations have mitigations against that or preparation to that effect.
Thank you, Mr. Waterhouse. Thank you, Mr. Motz. Is it Ms. Damoff? Oh, you're going to go in her place? Okay. Ms. Sahota.
Okay, thank you. My questions, really, they could go out to anybody. First and foremost, I'm really fascinated by this whole bug bounty scenario, and I know that it's been brought up before that you're encouraging it in your testimony that organizations use this and perhaps governments as well. I think it's been known that the Canadian government does not use bug bounties, but we do have Canadian companies that do. Shopify is one that I've read about, and there's various companies that have been using them. Now, I was just wondering if you could explain to me a little bit more about the trust factor and how, if a company is encouraging a bounty to be put out, which means that more and more hackers, whether they are good or are doing, the right thing in order to expose their vulnerabilities to protect themselves and the information of people, how can you be sure of that? How can you verify that? Like when you hire an employee, you do background checks and you trust that employee because of the rapport you've built with them. Now, these are unknown people that would be going into your systems and perhaps learning information that they may have. And even HackerOne, how do you ensure that those that are hacking on your behalf are giving you all the information that they've learned and not using it for any other cause?
I can take it. Thank you for the question, ma'am. We believe in strength in numbers, meaning that that there are more people on this planet who want to do good. Obviously, there's always going to be people who will have bad intentions, but HackerOne does not enable these criminals to do their work through HackerOne. If they have bad intentions, they can do that work already. What we're opening up, the thing that we're opening up here is for people who actually have good intentions to use HackerOne in order to do research for some of the reasons that my colleague Debbie mentioned earlier.
And that, and I mean, of course, people could go ahead and pursue and get that information themselves, but through this scenario, you're essentially encouraging them to, right? And you're encouraging them to go into the database of a given organization. So how do you ensure that the people that are working for you, for HackerOne, are credible people, reliable people?
So everybody who signs up for HackerOne has to provide information. As an example, we have to collect tax information in order to be able to pay them. Some of our customers require people to have background checks. Similar to the US DoD, we conduct these background checks all around the world in order to ensure the identity of that person before they are even given access to certain systems. At the end of the day, most of the systems that are part of the organizations are publicly facing, which means that everybody on the internet can already attack them. And to go back to my point that I made earlier of if there's one person who wants to do bad, there are multiple orders of magnitudes of people who want to do good. And if we give them the same incentives as criminals has in order to find those vulnerabilities, we believe that even if somebody outside of HackerOne finds that vulnerability and doesn't disclose it, there's enough people to find the exact same vulnerability and report it to the vendor directly.
Okay. You had talked a little bit about encouraging a law to be created that allows for people to legally be able to do this. And I guess that's because you feel there are some that are discouraged by the old laws that are in place. So could you explain that a little bit more to me? What would that law look like, and how would it be, I guess, upheld?
So just to add some additional data points, we did a study, 1 in 4 hackers, we did a study of our own hacking community. 1 in 4 hackers have at one time found a vulnerability but not reported it because the company didn't have a channel to disclose it. And so there's definitely, to Gilbert's point, many people out there, 1 in 4 hackers of our own community that wanted to do more and couldn't without a safe harbor. We're happy to work with any office to draft any law to put in the provisions, but it would just generally say the authority for a vulnerability disclosure policy. Hack DHS, Hack the Department of Homeland Security was just passed in January, and those requiring the DHS to have a vulnerability disclosure policy and a bug bounty pilot And so the language, I want to say it's about 6 or 7 pages long, but it authorizes the creation of VDP and a bug bounty pilot for that agency. And Hack the State Department was introduced by Congress earlier this year. So there's texts of language that are out there, but we can certainly help draft that language.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Motz, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I want to ask, get back to the question that we just finished on, Mr. Waterhouse, before on the electromagnetic pulse attack. In your opinion, where you think we are at as a country on being able to be prepared for that and to deal with that moving forward, not only for our power grids, but on any other possible targets of this sort of an attack?
Well, I saw the transition in the preparation during the Cold War ages. What I mean by that, during the 70s, 80s, computer systems in the armed forces throughout the world were a preview to that kind of threat. Systems, data rooms, data processing rooms were built to withstand any EMPs. As time progressed, and by the end of the Cold War, now it was considered too costly to proceed that way. So we went on, and I say we, different companies, to buy commercially off-the-shelf available computers. And this is how we are vulnerable today. So anywhere you see, unless you have a duly prepared room to sustain any EMPs, any system are vulnerable. The telco infrastructure is vulnerable. Any cars on the road that are highly electronic enabled are vulnerable. So to that effect, Mr. Muntz, we are just, sorry to say, but we are doomed if one gets out and blasted that 400 kilometers on top of North America. So North America itself will be down and way back in a way of life of 100 years ago, getting the heat with a wood stove and communicating with the smoke that will be coming out of that fire.
Along with pigeons, yes. So we've heard from a couple of my colleagues' questions, as well as from HackerOne, some comments on how we can do more to get more of subject matter experts involved in this particular industry in this country. From your perspective, what can government do to increase our capacity to deal with this from a ethical hacker perspective?
I'm not sure I'm following your question.
So we don't have, we have limited capacity in this country, subject matter experts in this country, to deal with what they're doing in the United States with the volume of ethical hackers that exist there. Is there anything that you, from your perspective, that the government can do to increase that capacity?
Well, currently we have agencies like CSC, the Cybersecurity Center, that are going on with initiatives to foster and enable some Hackfest festivals that are ongoing throughout the country, or conferences to that effect. So as an example, I was in the Hackfest festival in Quebec City in November, which is, for the last 10 years, have been fostered by CSC. So they have a preview of what's going on with the latest and greatest hackers that are around to do the hacks through whatever technology means they have at the time, and they are it's a pool of resources. They can go and get the best and from the latest and greatest. They can find their eyes on. You have AtlanticCon, you have another security conference in the BC, and then across the country like that, the agencies are active in figuring out what's going on a real-time basis. So getting out, and I believe with CCC's now being what it is today, I mean, it's alive, it will be getting itself more invested. That for me would be one positive point in having always a government agency be present in letting the community know that people are. I mean, I had Minister Gold, who just disclosed at that Hackfest festival in Quebec City that Canada wanted to have more hackers present to help the government of Canada fend off any bad influence in the next election. That was a first. So everybody was stunned by this announcement, and this is a positive point in which the government was letting the community know they want everybody to pitch in and do the best we can to not have in a situation like what happened in the States.
One last question. I don't know how much time I have left. Over the years, the cost of having your own business tested for outside penetration has always been expensive. And so it's been a pushback from companies that we can't afford this. It's almost like they can't not, it's almost opposite. They can't afford not to do it. has the prices come down, and is there, not from a price perspective, but is there some incentive that we can give companies from HackerOne's perspective, private companies, our small businesses, and even our large corporate businesses, the opportunity to ensure that they are at least resistant to outside attack?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Mods. Before I founded HackerOne, I used to be a penetration tester. One of the reasons why we started the company to begin with is because we believe that we need a scalable model that applies to every organization on this planet, that is also affordable for everybody on this planet. Like you pointed out, penetration testing has been or consultancy has been very expensive. We believe that the more the company has to protect, the more they need security. Because of that, everybody on this planet should be able to start their own vulnerability disclosure program. And on HackerOne, we have offerings that are free for open source and community organizations. And we have help or products available for people to actually establish that process for their organization, even without any incentives on the platform itself. By that, we believe that we will enable every organization on this planet to improve their defenses against a data breach.
Thank you, Mr. Motz. Mr. Spengelman, 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. And this is a perfect segue because I wanted to pick up on where Mr. Motz just left off. I think it's specifically relevant to small businesses to be mindful of the obstacles, I suppose, to develop good cyber infrastructure. We've got a lot of startups that are data intensive, where the protection of data matters early on in the corporation's lifetime, and there's a disproportionality in terms of the cost that's borne by those kinds of businesses versus our large banks. Besides the U.S. and Canada, are there any other jurisdictions that you could point to where partnerships have been established between companies like yourselves and the public sector to establish baseline levels of security that provide sort of a common good for the small business community, upon which then further models can be built as the companies grow and have more specialized demands in cybersecurity? Either of you, yeah, or both.
I can share some thoughts. Thank you for the question, Mr. The problem that we've seen with small organizations is that it is always a trade-off of risk, and there are checklists available or policy documentation around what to do as a small organization. Unfortunately, it is up to the organization in order to implement some of those best practices that have been established. We've seen organizations, especially smaller organizations, treat those more serious, especially as they become, like you said, more data intensive. However, we have not been able to establish checklists based on the vulnerability data that we've seen on the platform level yet, but we do expect that will happen in the next couple of years.
And just to follow up before we go over to Mr. Waterhouse, is there something that the public sector could supply? If you had a wish list vis-a-vis the public sector, whatever government or jurisdiction you're operating in, what could they supply to make your job easier?
We would be happy to work with third parties in order to establish that. I don't have a more concrete answer for you right now.
Okay. I'm sort of thinking along the lines of economics for baseline security for small business or neighborhood watch, whatever model one wants to apply. And it was already touched on in earlier dialogue. Mr. Waterhouse, do you have thoughts on?
Yes, sir. There already it exists already some of these documentations from the NIST in the U.S., which I could say has been projected internationally and is a good way to start for any businesses. That documentation that has been formatted for very large enterprises as well as to SMBs. So definitely, if an SMB is serious in protecting their data, they'll go through that. But coming from that background of SMBs, they don't have time to do that. So what will be needed is really something that's a one-click stop shop. They would just have to pay for the bare minimum and have a list of whatever mandatory verification that will be done and could be satisfactory to them. But what will be that satisfaction? Would that be for the payment card industry? Would that be satisfactory for privacy issues and so on? So there's no clear guidance in which the owner of whatever coffee shop wants to verify, okay, is my business satisfactorily safe for my business, for customers and so on? And do I offer internet access to the customers? If so, how do I do it? I go so many times on the road, and a bad habit of mine is to verify what's the security in these coffee shops. And most of the time you find that you have access to the cash register as well as the operation, the back in the back hard drive that has all the backups in it and access to the internet. So that's the kind of purview these SMB owners just want to make it work because they have so little room to and cash in order to get resources.
Do either of you, HackerOne or Mr. Waterhouse, have comments on the Canadian labor market with respect to folks that would provide good cybersecurity? How are we doing in terms of people going through programs and being trained, whether it's in the public sector, Canadian Forces, or in the private sector? Is there enough of a labor force out there for us to tap into if we're doing more in that sector as a government?
I'll start with that first answer. As you saw, there's so many statistics out there that says that there's a lack of cyber expertise, and to testify to that is really that even my calendar has reduced in the number of opportunities that I have to teach and train people on it. The reason why the costs have been going up for a few years, but also the people are not committed to do that job because it's a very demanding job, knowing a lot, especially from the back. How many operating systems do you have to know for how long in the past, and be able to adapt to the newest and latest and greatest that's coming around. That said, we do have universities that have good programs in place to train those people. I just ended off doing a micro program in cybersecurity at master's level with the University of Sherbrooke. We had 15 people in the class. Awesome program. It's just that we had only 15. I would have liked to have 115 because those people are really eager. They wanted to enhance their knowledge. They're professional at the trade, but it was one of the rare occasions they had. Back in the old days, I was with the University of Winnipeg back in 2003. The first certificate was out in the country, but the adoption is not present. It's not as forthcoming as in many countries. They have this in their school system.
Thank you, Mr. Spangman. Mr. Dubé.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I just want to go back to the issue of the next generation of networks, 5G, that's still being researched, and the metaphor that Ms. de Bruzen brought up, because the cardboard boxes that the armored truck is driving between our people, but I think they're also devices. Last meeting, we had an interesting conversation about the amount of devices that are going to be now in play because of next generation of networks and the speed capabilities. So, things like, robots being involved in surgery and the possibilities for agriculture with drones and things like that. So I'll start with HackerOne and I'll go to Mr. Waterhouse as well. But I'm just wondering, just in terms of price, and I was told that price isn't the only consideration, but as the market attempts to develop affordable devices for things like smart homes and all the other uses you can think of, is there a bit of a concern about a race to the bottom where security will be sacrificed? And so you can have the Fort Knox of networks, but ultimately if people have crappy firmware, if you'll forgive the expression, or lousy devices, that the whole thing is for naught. Is that a concern, and how do we address that?
Thank you for the question. I think this is one of the problems that I think we haven't figured out yet. We meaning the world. We are seeing that there's going to be a bigger problem in that if an organization does ship firmware that contains security vulnerabilities, that it at some point it might not matter. Because companies are getting away with it. With some of the recent changes that we see is that there's more consequences to an organization who are neglecting security, which I think is actually a good thing. Consumers demand a higher standard, especially when they buy a certain product. With that, I also believe that with some of the regulations being changed, where the government can demand certain or organization to comply with certain standards, is going to be very important for us to make sure that organizations do not have a chance to ship firmware that has not been tested, which in effect I hope will have or will mean that we're avoiding a race to the bottom.
Just before I go to Mr. Waterhouse to hear his take on that, I'm just wondering if you believe that planned obsolescence has any role to play in that. So we see, for example, devices no longer being compatible with new firmware, and I'm just wondering if we're incentivizing consumers to upgrade devices, perhaps at the expense of security, basically, of the networks that they're operating on and things like that. Because you would think updating firmware is a good thing, but on the other hand, someone might want to stay not completely disconnected, but use older technology and things like that. It might in some ways be safer. I don't know if I'm quite right on that, or if there's concern around that.
I think there is concern, and I think with the United States as well as the UK, they've adopted standards in the area of IoT. Like a list, the UK actually has a standard of 10 things that they recommend in the IoT area. Vulnerability disclosure policies is actually number 2. And then in the US, in the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, has taken a very active stance on requiring certain things that they see in the development of this area, as well as the FDA with medical devices. The FDA issued a medical device safety action plan last year, requiring a bunch of things, either in the development life cycle or at the launching a medical device. And so I think the unifying theme across all of these laws and standards is that it's because everything is interoperable and connected, everyone has to be doing the same thing. And so I think that's the purpose of all of these policies and standards, and unifying standards like NIST in these different areas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Waterhouse, pour terminer.
Mr. Waterhouse, to conclude.
There's so many devices that have been literally swamping the market, has been invading the market without any such verification that they are, they're put to the hands of people in the sense that they will facilitate their lives and enhance their environment. While on that side, they're selling, let's say, I'm going to take the example of a thermostat at $250 that nowadays will document your way of life and give that information to the company that is now Google, who owns these devices. So yes, remotely you'll be able to take on the possibility to remotely activate your heating in your house when you come home and program it, while at the same time they'll document when you're there and when you're not. So that for me is something that should have been taken in consideration before authorizing this kind of device on the market. And most of the people don't even realize this kind of device is documenting their lives as they go on. So even for the other devices that we'll find in cars, as an example, that more and more you'll have devices running the cars that will be hackable also at the same time, because there'll still be software that's incomplete.
Thank you, Mr. Dubé. And formally, we are at the end of our questions, but I see colleagues are still very keen, and I hope witnesses have a little bit of flexibility with respect to their time. So my intention is to run to sort of 5 o'clock, but I'm going to take a chair prerogative here and ask a question about cryptocurrency. In this morning's news, there was a story about a company called Quadra, something like Quadrarix or Quadra something, CX, and it was a cryptocurrency company, apparently worth about $250 million. The owner was about the same age as Mr. Abma, but died. And he had all of the passwords on his laptop. It strikes me as passingly bizarre that a $250 million company is completely locked up because nobody can open up the passwords on his laptop. So my first question is, is this a challenge for HackerOne? But my first question is this a on the face of it a massive disregarding of people's security? And the second question has to do with, even if you were able to get to the passwords, is blockchain technology such that even the skills of HackerOne or HackerOne on steroids can't actually play with the security of blockchain technology? So I apologize for it being an ill-formed question, but it does strike me as a situation where what we're supposed to be studying, which is financial security, comes together with a massive technological failure. But it may not turn out so bad in that no ill can come of a blockchain technology that I think can't be cracked. Am I right or am I wrong?
Thank you for the question. I'm familiar with the situation. The thing with blockchain technology is that there's two problems that I would like to point out. The first one is that current computers are simply not fast enough, that even if we would want to be able to crack some of the encryptions that are being used in blockchain technology, we simply don't have the computing power. It'll take many years for computing power to catch up on that. The second problem is that I think, especially with blockchain technology, because the technology is so new, is that consumers have put a lot of trust into these organizations that are well worth more than hundreds of millions of dollars, but have no idea what kind of defenses have been put in place, or where too many defenses have been put in place, that in which case they rely on a single person. In a way, it is the technologies are great, and I think that by experimenting with them is the right way to explore what their applications are. But I am not of the belief that the financial implementation that is taken today, like Bitcoin and some of the other cryptocurrencies, that is the right application for the blockchain itself. But the technology itself is very powerful and should and can be used to solve some of the problems that we've seen, similar to where a single person has the responsibility, essentially, for $250 million of other people, their money and assets.
Does it strike you as passingly absurd that the entire access to the system should be contained in one laptop?
Yes, that should never be the case.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you offline why this is. Now, for people who trade in blockchain or in cryptocurrencies, if there is a locking out of one cryptocurrency, that has, am I to assume, correct me if I'm wrong, am I to assume that all of the people who trade in cryptocurrencies and who have in their portfolio this particular kind of cryptocurrency are going to be affected? So it would be much larger than simply the clients of Quadriga. Is that a correct assumption or not?
One of the fortunate and unfortunate effects of blockchain or cryptocurrencies is that there only exists one copy of one particular block or a coin, depending on the cryptocurrency, which means that if an organization like this does not have access to those what they call wallets anymore, the money is essentially lost. And it'll never, there's no way to mathematically retrieve those wallets, let alone accessing them.
Really?
Does he deal in Bitcoin? Does he get an investor?
Yeah. All right. And final question, secondary issue. Much like Ms. Hoda, your organization strikes me as only as strong as its weakest link. So that you may have, I don't know, 20, 30,000 hackers apparently working for HackerOne, but that an individual in your organization may come across a vulnerability that it's actually financially more lucrative to not disclose that vulnerability than it is to disclose that vulnerability. And how, therefore, do you protect your client base from the people that you have vetted and work for you and you trust, et cetera?
I think this is a great question. This is why I believe hacker-powered security is so powerful. If there's a lot of people who have the same incentives, we believe that there's always more people who are able to find the same vulnerability. If one of those people, whether it is a criminal or not, decides not to disclose that security vulnerability, they do run the risk of other people identifying the exact same vulnerability and still end up disclosing it to the organization. We've never set out to compete against the black market, where essentially zero-day vulnerabilities have been traded either with governments or private organizations. But the bug bounty programs have definitely created a perverse incentive for these black hat hackers to go after these vulnerabilities, because the prices are essentially going up simply because the chances of the people who with good intentions finding the same vulnerability is skyrocketing today.
I'd like to follow up that, but my colleagues also have questions, and we have just a few minutes left. Is it Mr. Spengler or Mr. Picard?
Yeah, just one quick question. Peut-être M. Waterhouse en premier.
Mr. Waterhouse, to begin with, if the Canadian government wanted to use hackers' services, the services of hackers or security specialists, must I go through a recognition, a legalization process, an accreditation process? I'm thinking of legitimate courses with the classification that would be required to train these hackers. I understand the question, Mr. Picard. Can the government call upon the services of a recognized or unrecognized hacker? Well, if there's a contract put out by Supply and Services, it has to be done properly, and there has to be a chapter for security. So there's a security investigation that's undertaken. If you have an individual or group of individuals who work with government services, they have to operate legally to obtain the necessary authorizations, etc. But there's an important dimension here. And I'll move now to HackerOne.
In quite a young age, and I think at this time it might not have been as legal as it should, but you managed to put together a pretty good company and legal company, well recognized, and now you are a legit, well recognized company. What kind of process did you went through in order to be recognized and work with the government?
Are you asking for business advice?
No, I wanted them to open a branch in Canada.
From a personal perspective or from a company perspective?
Let's stay corporate.
One of the things that we've been very proud of is the improvement that people have seen by leveraging the hacker community in order to create a mature security organization, up to the point where we've we've seen, like even for our own security, we've seen that even with our expertise in security, there's always problems being uncovered by other people who are much smarter than ourselves or more creative. The model works, and because of our relationship with the hacker community, we are able to build product that help organizations establish a relationship with the hacker community and essentially mediate between the two if necessary. But our success is solely to the success of the hacker community and what kind of security vulnerabilities they have found in our customers.
My concern is that from a practical standpoint, it's great. From a legal standpoint, being a state of law, we have to make sure that we don't engage contracting quote-unquote delinquent by definition, therefore legitimizing illegal activity for our own purpose and our own good. That doesn't work. We have to work with something legal in order to justify our action. Did you have to go through some sort of recognition or erasing a past file or whatever?
I think with the DoD, we had to pass additional requirements. The hackers had to pass additional vetting requirements from the Department of Defense. I think what the Canadian government can do is what the U.S. government did, which is making the Hack the Pentagon series of programs very, very public. It opened up the doors for a lot of the hackers to invite them to hack on the platform. And so I think that set a motion going with the acceptance of inviting the talent that's out there that you might not know. And then I think there are some programs where there's hackers sign additional NDAs directly with the customer or the client, or customers can ask only citizens of certain countries, like the US, I think in some cases. Some customers only want US citizens on the platform. So we work with the customer to see what makes them comfortable, and then select which hackers would be best for their program.
Thank you. Let Mr. Waterhouse finish this off.
We do, Mr. Picard, already have companies throughout the country that are engaged in white hat hacking kind of activities. So there are legitimate companies. There are no criminals involved. People coming out from the university circuit, getting hands-on experience, just like I did throughout life, and they can put on a solid solution also, just like HackerOne is doing. So just on top of my mind, you have the GoSecure in Montreal, which is well-renowned, and they got people. They're fed by people coming out of university, and they're very professional, just like this lady and gentleman are with HackerOne.
Okay. Well, with that, I think we'll adjourn our meeting. I want to thank each of you on behalf of the committee, but also personally, for a fascinating hour and a half. This window into cybersecurity is getting more and more complicated the further we study it. And again, thank you, and we appreciate it. And I'm sure our friends in California have a much better weather window than do we. Thanks again. Meeting adjourned.